all of these things have been intended by many different governments.
In the future, we can actually get more people out of poverty.
Because if that worked, we wouldn't still have persistent poverty.
You can't force employers to pay the same EPF percentage. Hello everybody and welcome to NST's Beyond the Headlines, where we peel the most pressing issues shaping Malaysia. My name is Amalina Kamal, your host, and of course I'm joined by my co-host,
Hazwin Hassan. Today we are unpacking two big topics: the 13 billion ringgit allocated for Sara and Sumbangan Tunai Rahmah STR aid, part of the Madani Economic Framework, and to making EPF contributions mandatory for foreign workers. Now, both of these are set to have a significant impact on Malaysia's economy and society.
and of course, to help us navigate these two topics, we have first up on our panel, Economist Dr. Geoffrey Williams, who's no stranger to the show actually.
Thank you for inviting me. First
Yes.
time this year. Happy New
First
Year.
time this year, but not the first on the set. Happy New Year.
No, not the first on the set. Many times on the set. Yeah.
So also another familiar face, we have Dr. Tricia Yeoh, who is Nottingham University Malaysia's School of Politics and International Relations Associate Professor and Public Policy Expert. Thank you, Doctor, so much for being here as well.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, and also Happy New Year to all.
Before we jump into the questions, I would like to set the stage a little bit for at least to our audience back home who might not know this. 13 billion ringgit is a hefty amount. It's actually a significant amount. Of course, essentially to help, raise or at least provide financial relief to lower income groups, especially in the face of, the rising cost of living. Now, the question is whether 13 billion ringgit here is enough, or to what extent is the government able to support this?
That's right, Amalina. It sure is. But as always with such policies, the devil is in the details. There are questions about its effectiveness, sustainability, and how it will be managed, especially in remote regions like Sabah and Sarawak. So, Jeff, let's start with you first. 13 billion ringgit is a huge amount, but how do you assess the impact of this aid and its distribution on Malaysia's fiscal deficit?
I think that what we've seen for this year is that they're changing the way that they're allocating it.
Right.
And I think that's really good because it's something I've been banging on about for the longest time.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, they are moving to pay it on a monthly basis. They're allocating it through the MyCard. And it's basically a cash transfer. And that, to me, is very much more important than the total amount. The total amount is, for sure, it's large. There's no question about that. But it can be larger because the subsidy rationalization, if you take the diesel rationalization, was 7.5 billion, twice as much as they expected.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have the RON 95 coming, that's expected to be 8 billion. We had the electricity subsidy, which is 4 billion, and there's a little bit from chicken price,
Right.
which is about 1.5 billion. That's about 20 billion. If you added the 20 billion to the 13 billion, you could give everybody in Malaysia 100 ringgit every month. Everybody. And that would be the foundations of a universal basic income. If you did that, by giving it on an individual basis, I mean everybody, every man, every woman, every child gets it on an individual basis. The only criteria is that they are Malaysian. If you did that on a monthly basis, even the people who are currently on the STR-Sara allocations would get more. They would get more and better allocation.
Right. So the question is not necessarily in terms of the amount, but as you mentioned, we are actually, to be fair, we can actually offer more.
Yes.
That's also dependent on the expected incoming income that we'll be getting through the subsidy rationalization. Yes. But the real question then is in terms of what Hazwin just mentioned. Can this be, transferred or trickled down to the remote areas? We'll go into the MyCard utilization in a bit. But your take, Dr. Tricia. Mm-hmm.
Sure. I think I'd like to start by taking a bigger, broader approach to the way government makes decisions around its fiscal policy. So governments are always in a conundrum, and what you see today in terms of the changes that the government is making, the subsidy rationalization, the increased cash handouts, all of these things have been intended by many different governments over the last decade or so. We've been talking about this, in these sorts of talk shows over and over again, but because of certain political contexts, certain political interests, none of the governments really had the impetus to go full swing into full subsidy rationalization. It's a difficult decision to make.
And not a popular one, definitely.
It's not a popular one. I mean, in the past, there have been a lot of protests on the streets whenever you have increase of petrol prices just by a couple of cents, right? So what I'm saying is governments have to make that tough decision of removing subsidies which hamper the government bill, and in exchange be able to target selected groups that really need it. And this is a long-term effort. I do believe we're moving in the right direction because governments have to make decisions, right, over where you best use the ringgit, which are, by the way, funded by the public. So these are public taxpayers' money. And how you utilize the money. You have savings. Do you invest the money that you do have? Do you distribute it to the rest of society? Who deserves it the best? So these are important policy decisions. And where we are now, it's positive and healthy. And my response would be that it's a good thing to see the increase of targeted cash handouts to those who really need it. And echoing what Professor Geoffrey has said, using the MyCard is a great way to facilitate that. Because another thing that a lot of us researchers and analysts have been complaining about is that there are multiple databases which have not been consolidated. So we are also seeing a move towards consolidating these multiple databases so that there is maximum information about a typical household in Malaysia. What are they earning? What are their requirements? What are their needs?
So we're talking about objective, and we're talking about the, I suppose, breakdown of how we're going to transfer those cash aids properly. But in terms of policies that can be introduced or at least pushed to complement this current STR and SARA aid effort, do you think that we can be expanding on some or at least introduce some? And is it too premature to tell without looking at how the behavior of our rakyat is towards this particular handouts first?
So, of course, you need to ideally do data analysis, right? So you collect the data, you see how policies are rolled out and implemented, and then you see how people respond to these things. There are many different kinds of policy tools that the government can utilize apart from cash handouts. In fact, the government has, to be honest, experimented with some of these in the past already, right? Where you impose certain things like the menu rahmah of a certain amount of money and fee. You could also do things like cash vouchers and tie these cash vouchers to specific needs. So in the past, some of these things, for example, people would get certain cash, but you can only use it for purchase of books. And that is also meant to advance a certain policy objective. So again, which tools do you want to utilize to advance a certain policy goal? But the data needs to come in first to see whether the ramifications or the positive implications of taking stage 1 and then moving on to stages 2, 3, 4, and so forth, that's really important.
In terms of learning from data, right? I think we should have enough data because this isn't the first time we've had cash transfers. We had BRIM before. What can we learn? What can the government now learn from BRIM in the past?
We can learn that it didn't work. And we can also learn that the cash transfers or the vouchers or the book vouchers or anything like that, we know that that doesn't work. Because if that worked, we wouldn't still have persistent poverty, right? By definition, if it worked, it would have solved the problem, or at least gone a long way to solving the problem. So in the last few months, the government has been announcing state by state that they've been able to eradicate hardcore poverty, right? That has been done through cash transfers, not through any other form of welfare intervention. In fact, if we look at the welfare industry across any country in the world, we know that when you have so-called targeting, or we give you a voucher, or we give you it because we think you need it, or there's a policy agenda for books, or something like that. Everywhere in the world it fails. And the most effective way of dealing with social protection and social welfare infrastructure is to raise people's incomes by giving them direct cash transfers. Everywhere. That is the absolute best solution all round, from a social perspective, a policy perspective, an economics perspective. It cuts the wastage, the leakages, and the corruption. It gives people money directly for them to choose how they want to spend it on themselves and their families. And that's what we have learned in the past, and that's where we are moving now, right? At the moment, they will start, of course, they will start with a small group of people who are in the lowest income groups, of course. And then they will learn lessons about the implementation. Can they implement it through MyCard? Can they implement it into more remote communities? Are people signing up properly? All of this sort of thing. They can learn that lesson. That's an important lesson, but that's a very straightforward implementation lesson. Once that's been done, then they can spread it out to everybody.
Yeah, I think another thing to add with this data collection is to note that ideally these sorts of cash transfers should not be fully dependent, should not be the only source of dependency for households. Yes, we know that in every society there will be households that live in abject poverty, but if we are thinking of raising incomes, actually the best way is to think about the larger infrastructure and ecosystem of provision of jobs. So what I'm saying is that while cash transfers and handouts is a good solution, governments have to be able to balance that against everything else that we want in terms of stimulating the economy. I know we're not talking about that today, but what's the direction of the economy? Are sufficient jobs being provided? Is the private sector being allowed to be stimulated in a freer manner? And hopefully we see these wages and incomes rising. Of course, with some support from government as well.
Right. And talking about that, we are expecting the wage, or at least the minimum wage, increasing this February from 1,500 to 1,700. But that's for another day. But yes, if we want to look at this discussion to be more forward-thinking, I think what we want to try to address is that the policy is not a quick fix solution, I suppose. There needs to still be observation, analysis, and that is where...
I don't agree with you, actually.
Okay.
It is a quick fix.
It is a quick fix?
It is a quick
okay.
fix.
But how do we navigate the
Because
challenge between short-term, I suppose...
well, people said this about Padu.
Fixes and
Right.
long-term...
Yeah, people said this about Padu.
Sorry?
Right? About
Padu,
Padu. About the point of the Padu database is to find what people's income is, and then to switch that into some sort of idea of net disposable income on an individual basis. And people are saying, oh, we couldn't possibly do it, it would take forever, oh, how could it, it will never work. And actually, it was implemented in a matter of months.
I see.
Actually, it was. And although people were saying, well, not everybody has signed up, which is true, but it was only really the wealthy who didn't sign up. And often they didn't sign up because they didn't feel that they were going to be a recipient of any, there was no purpose for them to do it.
Right.
Most of the people who have some option of being a recipient of some welfare assistance, they have signed up. And that happened very, very quickly. I think, the Economy Ministry should be given credit for that.
Okay.
If you'd have handed this in a previous administration, they would have handed it to an external consultant, and it would have taken 5 or 10 years to do this. And actually, it was done by the Economy Ministry internally in a matter of months. Now, of course, it has to be updated regularly. But the incentive to update it is exactly what we're seeing now, which is that if you update and your information is accurate, then you're going to get your 100 ringgit transfer more quickly, right? And that will mean that people will actively update it. There's an incentive for them to update it.
So
it can be done quickly.
Of quick fixes, is it right for me to put it this way? So it's supposed to just be a buffer for, say, transient shocks, the immediate shock people feel, perhaps in the very poor households where something untoward happens, like, their children get sick and they just need that little extra to, get meds or food or whatever. Is it right to put it that way?
Well, the STR, which is a variant all the way back from
Right.
BRIM, it's had various incarnations. Every government has a different name for it. It is essentially a cash transfer, but in the past it was transferred on 2 or 3 times a year and lump sum, normally before one of the festivals, right? And that's how it was done. And so when it's transferred as a lump sum before Raya,
Yep.
people spend the whole lot. They spend it on preparation for Raya, right? And they have nothing left. So if you transfer this now into a monthly payment, it means that it becomes a normal part of their budget, right? And then when it's a normal part of their budget, it's actually
A disposable income
it's
sort
actually
of
part
behavior.
of their
yeah.
net disposable income.
Yeah.
And it's actually not a small amount if it's done on an individual basis. If you have 4 people in a household, you would be getting 400 a month. That is, 2 parents and 2 children.
Right.
It's 400 a month. That is actually a reasonable amount of it's not lavish. It's not meant to be lavish. If it were too lavish, people would just give up working and go ahead and do that. Of course,
Right,
they're never
right.
going to do that. But it's more than sufficient to cover basic necessities and emergencies and have some money set aside for emergency, for example. And because we're moving into that process, regular monthly payments is a very important component of a successful and sustainable social welfare infrastructure. If you give it to people 2 or 3 times a year, they will spend it, especially if you give it to them ahead of a holiday.
Okay, so for the Sumbangan Tunai Rahmah, just to kind of give a little bit more context to our audience as well, that's 13 billion, an increase from 10 billion of last year. But the Sara 8 in specific, it's going to be increased to 2,000 ringgit compared to 1,200 ringgit last year for eligible household, and there's going to be more than 5 million households, or at least recipients, to receive this particular assistance beginning April 2025. Until then, what can the government do to ensure that the behavior, or at least the acceptance towards it, is okay, and not seeing as, because we want to move away from this culture of depending on the state too much, as you mentioned, right? But there are other elements that we must consider, meaning from the person themselves. How can they move away from having to depend on the government to help them during rainy days?
It's their money. It's not a question of dependency on the government. Actually, I don't see it as that. I see this as a reverse income tax, right?
Okay.
That's what it is. You set the threshold. You use PADU to see whether you're above or below the threshold. If you're above the threshold, you pay income tax in a normal way. If you're below the threshold, you are eligible for this payment, tax credit. You're getting money back. And what that means is that there's no particular incentive to stop working. There's no particular incentive to stop doing what you're already doing if you're running a micro enterprise, for example. It doesn't actually have that effect of disincentivizing normal economic activity, particularly because it's not very much. It's enough to cover basic necessities, but it's not enough for you to stop working, or to stop what you're already doing. It's just a little bit more. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I largely agree with Professor Geoffrey's analysis. I would just add that we do need to ensure that this sort of program and system moving forward is sustainable for a number of reasons. Number one, the amount in total is increasing. Number two, you're increasing the number of households or individuals who are receiving it as well. And the more efficient the system is, the more people would want to sign up, as we are talking about signing up for PADU and so on. The sustainability of fiscal policy in the long run is affected by so many different factors. I think at the federal government level, again, they are making the right steps in the right direction, but we never know when political changes take place. And as we know, any sort of demand from the people is very difficult to resist. What are these demands? For example, demands for increasing even further a cash transfer to amount that perhaps is not sustainable to meet our own fiscal deficit targets or our debt to GDP ratio targets, which had already increased as a result of COVID, right? The last few years have been tough on us fiscally. And we do have, again, from the legislation side, it's a good thing that we have passed in Parliament the Public Finance and Fiscal Responsibility Act. However, the Act itself is believed to be by some economists to not be as stringent as it could be.
Right.
So in terms of setting ourselves, keeping ourselves in check, what are the disciplinary approaches, what are the ceilings of how much we can withdraw, how much we can borrow to fund our debt and so on. So again, good policy steps, but just be cautious about the future. A last point here is that an example perhaps of poor policy decision making is when at the height of COVID and then following that severe floods that took place in north of Peninsular Malaysia, the demands from people to withdraw their EPF savings early resulted in a situation in which a large majority of our retirees today actually do not have sufficient savings to last them their retirement age. Meaning to say that the majority of retired Malaysians today live on their children through transfers. So these are cash transfers, but coming from the next
Within the
generation
family.
that's supposed to be saving for their children as well. These are just some broader
Cautionary
points
notes,
to
but
think about. Yes.
I do understand.
You see, that's all of that is correct in my view. However, what we are talking about here is simply reallocation of the government funds. There's the subsidy rationalisation, and the Prime Minister has been very clear about this. It isn't about reducing subsidies. It's about reallocating the subsidies from blanket subsidies, in particular on diesel and petrol, and then to make the savings, and then to reallocate the savings in a different way. And the question then is, how do you reallocate the savings?
How, where?
Yeah,
and
how,
all that,
where. And you see, if you were to extend the monthly 100 ringgit payments, for example, across the entire population, in principle, if the government wished, they could put it into the EPF account.
If there are, I suppose,
If they
surplus.
wished, if they were concerned about how people were going to spend it, you put it into the EPF, you can then withdraw part of it through account flexible, right? But then you're rebuilding your EPF. That's one option. There are very many options. But what's important is to stop putting it in the subsidy of petrol and then to use it directly for to raise people's incomes and to help support people through the proper social protection system. But it's important to remember that everybody needs access to a social protection system, one way or another. Even the most wealthy, actually, even the so-called top 15%, wherever this came from, even they benefit from subsidies. And where do we get this T15? We got it from the electricity subsidy exercise. Because when they changed the electricity subsidies, 85% of users weren't affected, and 15% of users were. But the fact of it is, from the electricity subsidy rationalisation, even the wealthy get access to subsidies below 600 kilowatt hours. And that's why there was no noise about the electricity subsidy rationalisation, because everybody had access one way or another. Yeah. In a progressive way. That is, if your income rises, you benefit less. If your income's lower, you benefit more. That's progressivity. But it's the reverse of taxation. If your income rises, you pay more tax, and if your income is lower, you pay less tax. And it's the reverse of that.
Because you mentioned about the EPF withdrawals during the pandemic, and I think that was very telling about how people really are still not responsible enough to think ahead. So coming back to the idea of having these cash transfers as a form of, to provide short-term relief and as a buffer, in the long run, how is the government then going to be more responsible towards making sure that there is more responsible behavior among people, so that it's not just about a temporary fix or a quick fix, but more so that in the future we can actually get more people out of poverty? Isn't that the ultimate goal? Either
Well,
of you, yeah.
I suppose what the government is doing with EPF
Mhm.
by splitting the accounts in certain ways, right? So yeah, there's the fixed account where you can't withdraw
Mhm.
until your retirement, and then the flexible account you can use it for certain things. So placing conditions on EPF, that is one way. The other thing is, which requires a much longer discussion, is actually to do with healthcare, because Malaysians pay quite a high proportion of their pocket in terms of medical insurance. There's been a lot of talk about having a national insurance scheme, the likes of, say, Singapore. And the reason I bring that up is because you're talking about quick fix versus investing into the future.
Mhm.
When people age, so you're talking about an aging society, which
Yeah.
Malaysia will
Is.
is
Yeah.
already.
Yes, yes.
What share of your pocket and what kind of expenses you are spending on your medical expenses and healthcare? That's a question
That
of
has
how
yet to
you
be, yeah.
balance between withdrawing your money now, spending it on your children or festive occasions, versus leaving it in for the long term when you will actually need it.
The key to it, as far as I can see, coming back to what you were saying about responsible spending and the episodes of the withdrawals, the EPF withdrawals, and then also the BRIM itself and how that has been done, it's because of the periodicity of it. It's because it isn't done on a monthly basis. Right,
Okay.
that's where the so-called
It's like a lump sum.
irresponsibility-
Back to your
because
point,
it's been
yeah.
in lump sums, and then the same was true also of the EPF withdrawals. And you'll remember that before EPF introduced account flexible, there were people saying, "I want another withdrawal round," right? In other words, they want another lump sum. And what EPF basically said is, "All right, we understand that you want to withdraw, but we don't want you to withdraw it in a lump sum. Or if you are going to withdraw it in a lump sum, the lump sum's going to be smaller, right? We're going to keep as much more. So we're giving you access." So it's the change in which the assistance is provided which makes a difference in how people spend it. Because if you get a smaller amount on a monthly basis, you're more likely to spend it responsibly
Yeah.
than if you get a big chunk of
Yeah.
money on a periodic basis. And that happened with the EPF withdrawals as well. So they took a big chunk of money and they thought they'd won the lottery. And actually, in some instances, and they hadn't, right? And then it had gone. And then they have to rebuild that.
I heard that most of them used it to spend on weddings, on very lavish weddings that they
Or
would
handbags and
otherwise
things like
wouldn't
that.
have been
Yeah.
able to
I don't-
afford.
Well, I
agree
think
with
that
the
many
initial.
people used it, but the first round, I think that many people used it in the first round because they were in need. But then those who were most in need very quickly ran out of EPF. There was nothing left for them. The second round, there were fewer. Third round, fewer. And then when you were getting into the second and third round, people were withdrawing it for investment purposes.
Right.
Or they were withdrawing it to buy gold, or they were withdrawing it for family events, or many micro entrepreneurs were withdrawing it in order to invest in their company. In other words, they were withdrawing it for reasons that were not the original aim. The
Yeah.
original aim was immediate response to the need from COVID, right?
But that's the thing. Hence, that's why, I mean, the greater part of this discussion is that how can we ensure people are more accountable with the aid that they get or the
Well,
assistance that they get?
the truth is, it's their money. It's actually their money, and it is completely up to them to decide how they spend it, right? But in terms of the sustainability of the entire process, if you give them a smaller amount of money on a more regular basis, it becomes a normal part of their disposable income. And when it's a normal part of the disposable income, all of these issues about I'm going to blow it on a wedding or something like that, they go away, right? If they have a family event like a wedding coming up, they have to save it like everybody else, right? If they have long-term aims like pensions, they have to save it like everybody else. And that's what makes this much more a normal part of everyday spending, requires budgeting, requires financial literacy, and what they wish to do with their own money is a matter for them,
Right. Yeah.
actually.
Right. Okay. I want to go into having the My Card being introduced as the tool
Yeah.
to ensure the STR and SARA 8 it's trickled to the recipient itself. How can the government ensure that the use of this My Card does not create further divide when it comes to people who are accessible to the digital sphere versus those in the rural area? I mean, everybody has a My Card, but not everybody understands the facilities of it, right? Or having access to it.
Mm.
Can we just start with Tricia first?
Yeah, I just want to make one comment before I forget. The whole conversation earlier reminds me of what some governments around the world do, like in the UK and Singapore, where they incorporate behavioral economics into how they make decisions around public policy, where you actually analyze a person's or a society's behavior, a group of people's behavior, or you could even start by doing pilot programs, and you actually nudge them in the right direction. So there are famous books written about this subject, but one famous example is when you want people to donate your organs, for example. So instead of opting in, if you make it such that the default is to donate and you opt out, so you physically have to do the opting out, you find that a much larger percentage of people will decide to donate their organs. And you can apply that kind of behavioral economics principle across the board. You can apply that to anything from subsidy rationalization to how people spend. And I think that's precisely, and this is probably a really brilliant way of ensuring that people are responsible. So yes, on the one hand, it is people's money, but the government also wants to be able to set certain bounds, right? So that they're not burdened in their retirement ages. But yeah, the point about behavioral economics is something that I think we should not experiment with, but we should definitely have a whole department dedicated to behavioral economics within our ministries to help them make decisions on how you can nudge people in certain ways. Your question was about My Card.
Right, yeah.
How this will not create a divide between people
or exacerbate the digital divide. Then.
Right. Well, in fact, I think this is probably one of the least problematic methods when it comes to the whole digital divide issue, which, by the way, I think it's becoming less and less of a problem in Malaysia. Yes, there are still pockets of people in the rural areas that don't have connectivity, but by and large, I think it's also quite patronizing to assume that people don't know how to use smartphones. No, once they have it in their hands, it actually very quickly can be adopted. I think you're thinking about maybe people who are illiterate. And again, literacy and numeracy rates in Malaysia are actually quite high at the basic level, right? So when it comes to My Card, I do think that, again, it's one of the least problematic because everyone knows that they have one. And it's a physical card. And it's been around for individuals to use for MRT and LRT and so on for a very long time as well. So in terms of having a great divide, I don't think that it would be as problematic as some may foresee it to be. In fact, the start of using My Card for cash transfers is excellent because it can set a precedence for using the My Card in the RON 95 subsidy rationalization as well at the petrol pump. I know several different proposals have been put forward as to how My Card can be used. I think the main problem, though, that we need to think about is whether the My Card can be abused. So it's not about lack of knowledge of how to use it. Everyone knows, okay, you can just tap it, right? I mean, touch and go. It's the same idea. It's been around for decades. But the problem is that may occur is whether My Cards can be exchanged and used and abused for the petrol pump. So, if your income levels are set and linked to your My Card, and people in the B40 category would have greater access, say, to more highly subsidized RON 95, or maybe they will have higher quota of usage within a certain month. Could those My Cards then be exchanged? so that others can use up the
Right.
B40 quota.
Right.
Yeah, that's an implementation problem.
That's
Understood.
definitely going to happen. There's no question that that's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean,
And
leakages is still...
You know that from the
Yeah.
outset.
Yeah.
You don't even need to do the pilot to know that that's
That's
going to
true,
happen.
that's true.
There will be people who will have a My Card and don't have a car.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Like,
you're basically
yeah.
you're going to set up. They're going to trade it. There's
Yeah.
no question that that's
Yeah.
it. But this issue of the My Card, we had discussed multiple ways in which we can, from an implementation perspective, what is the most pragmatic way of getting the money to people,
Yep.
short of giving them cash,
Yeah.
or making them go to the post office to pick it up from somewhere like that. And the government even tried to encourage people to take e-wallets. They gave everyone 100 ringgit
Via
on an
DG, yeah.
e-wallet if your income was below 100,000. And it appears that actually the take-up of that might not have been as popular as they had thought, or people already had an e-wallet. I had made a proposal that you just transfer it through the LHDN, the tax system. But then I was disabused of that because I was told that actually not everybody has a tax number. But then there was a proposal to have everybody have a tax number, which doesn't appear to have progressed very far. But then somebody made the point, well, why do you need everybody to have a tax number when everyone already has an IC number? And where is the
That is
IC
true.
number? The
Yeah.
IC number is in the My Card, right?
Yep.
So that's much more simple, much more simple way of doing it in principle.
Yeah, I mean,
But my concern about the My Card is that it's a tracking device, actually. And
for
yes, because the way in which it's being proposed now is that you can only use it for 13 categories in selected stores. Okay, and
Okay.
that does, to me, that raises very big red flags about, first, the
privacy.
privacy. Secondly, why is the government telling you what you should spend money on
Right.
and not?
Okay.
And third, why is the government telling you where you should buy your groceries and not buy your groceries? And fourth, if I'm a grocer, a mom and pop store, and I'm not on this list, I'm going to lose custom, right? And that's going to have an impact on local
Yeah.
communities. Why are they telling you where to spend it, how to spend it, what to spend it on? And then you have to put in your number, so it's not just a swipe. So that does cause problems.
Yeah.
And then it also causes problems that if I have a My Card and I don't need it, I'm going to sell it.
Well,
And
let's-
particularly if that's used for petrol. This is
Right.
absolutely the worst way of dealing with the petrol. We know what the petrol subsidy solution is. It's tiered pricing.
Yeah.
In fact, I got a standing ovation last night by just explaining to people what tiered pricing in petrol was. It's the same as tiered pricing in electricity, right? That's the solution, not some idea that you have to prove who you are in order to get a discount on petrol.
Yeah.
It's absurd, absolutely absurd to
Yeah.
do that. But the use of the My Card was simply a matter of pragmatism. How do you actually get money to people? If you try to do it through e-wallets and through phones,
There's another
you do
onboarding
have the
process,
digital
yeah.
divide issue, and I think that's
That's right,
real.
yeah.
I think it is actually quite a real issue, that particularly for people who are older, who might not be so familiar with it.
Right.
But it to me, it appears the most practical, the most pragmatic first way of trying to get it into people's hands, so to speak. And then if that doesn't work, eventually they just offer it across different payment channels. And then you can opt in to different payment channels. That's what I would suggest. Later on, you could opt into something that's much more convenient for you.
Right, right. And on that note, I suppose it's also, I think in the future, maybe there's not just selected, I suppose, outlets, participating outlets or partnering outlets to
Oh, that
participate.
should
right?
go now. It's not in the future. That should go
Nah.
now, immediately.
Right.
And somebody should really raise this issue. How did these companies get on this list of being
That's true.
preferred providers for this?
And do you think that this sort of creates an incentive for data selling?
Yes,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah, I mean,
That's,
the bigger issue here is about data security
Yes.
and the data privacy laws in the
Right.
country which need updating.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I do
Definitely.
agree.
Yeah.
Okay. Shifting gears now to our second topic of interest. Well, the 2025 budget also highlighted a policy mandating EPF contributions for foreign workers. And recently there was an announcement of making it mandatory, which is quite a shift from the previous optional status, right?
Yeah, totally. It's a move towards ensuring foreign workers have retirement savings, but it raises some concerns. Now, Jeff, regarding labor costs and employment patterns in industries that rely heavily on foreign workers, what are some of the more potential macroeconomic implications raised, and should employers worry?
Okay, I'm a foreign worker.
Okay.
And I've been here for 21 years. So what the government has done now, because of this mandatory issue, people are focusing, of course, on the low-income foreign workers,
yeah.
right? So from a macroeconomic perspective, there are a number of implications. Obviously, the foreign workers, their salaries now have, they're going to rise because of the minimum wage. If they weren't on the minimum wage before, or if they were on the minimum wage, that's going to go up. And then on top of that, there's an additional cost because the employers have to make a contribution to EPF. And what that's going to do is to push up the price of foreign workers at in the lower income groups, right? But then there are opportunities and costs to that. Clearly, for the foreign workers, it sounds like a good thing. First, their salary is going to go up, and then they're going to get on top of that a pension contribution, savings contribution. Clearly for them, yes, that's a good thing. But their take-home pay is possibly not going to increase by as much as you might think.
Yeah.
Because if the minimum wage goes up by 200 ringgit, but then they have to make a contribution from that for their employee contribution to EPF, then the increment that raises their wage is going to go to EPF. So their take-home pay is going to be roughly the same. Then they get an additional increase in their salary from the EPF contribution from their employer. But again, that doesn't go into their wallet.
True.
It goes into the EPF. But that's all good for them, because when they eventually go home, they will get opportunity to cash it in.
Right.
And while they're here, they will still have access to account flexible. So they can get at least 10% of that. So it goes up a little bit. So for them, everything's better, and they have some savings, and that makes life better for them. But you know what the employers are going to say, and you know what the employers are already going to are already saying. They are saying that this is going to raise costs, and that they are going to have to pass these costs on to consumers. Right? They always say that. They always say that. But at the same time, there are very many people who have been saying we need to reduce dependency on foreign workers. And the way to reduce dependency on foreign workers is to raise the cost of foreign workers. So if you want to reduce the dependency on foreign workers, you have to raise the costs. And they are raising the costs.
Either way, you still have to do it.
You still have
basic
to do
math. But on that note, right, also, Tricia, let's talk about the implementation challenges of this particular policy. Dr. Geoffrey, you did mention one of them. But what sort of major hurdles do you foresee, and how can they be overcome to ensure smooth execution, at least?
Well, the first thing would be facing resistance from the various employers at large. I think we already saw some of these large companies like the FMM, the Federation of Malaysian Manufacturers, as well as the MEF. I believe that these are the two main stakeholders, the Malaysian Employers Federation, coming out really strongly against it. There are many actually other associations that have come up strongly against it. I don't know what the process was that government has taken to come to this decision, but one thing from a policy process standpoint, the consultations, I hope, took place at the bare minimum, right? Inviting them as in very important stakeholders to the table, informing them transparently what is going to happen, what the mechanism is that this is going to take place, and then don't leave them without any information at all. So I don't know. I'm not one of the stakeholders in the fray, but based on what I've read, it sounds like they have not meaningfully consulted But they could also be throwing out the red herring, right? As Professor Geoffrey says, this is something that you always see coming each time an announcement is made about any sort of cost implication to the industry, whether it's minimum wage, and whether it's the other contribution that the employers will have to make now for foreign workers would be a tiered levy, so a foreign workers levy. So what they're saying is that there are three, like kind of a triple whammy cost implication for them now, which will be passed on to the consumers. So one is the increase of minimum wage, two is this tiered foreign levy, and then now the third would be the mandatory EPF contribution.
Right.
So your question was on the implementation. What are the hurdles that will be faced?
No,
the main
because
thing would be the resistance
right.
from employers.
Right. Now, because we do have, we've gained comments not just from the employers' side, but also, SWACAM. The commissioner actually did say, because there's a lack of uniform policy here. And also the fact that you can't force employers to pay the same amount of percentage, EPF percentage to foreign workers. How would that affect employment processes and advantage here? So
why can't you require them to pay the same
at
to
least
foreigners?
for MEF here, they're saying that
Who
the
cares
operational
what they
cost.
say? Honestly,
Yeah.
really, if it's they will always make that complaint. The issue is this: somebody comes and they have a job, right? They're doing the same job, whether they are Malaysian or they're foreign. Why do you say, you are Malaysian, you get the benefit, you are foreign, you don't get the benefit? What is the purpose of that, right? It makes absolutely no sense from an economics perspective.
Okay.
Right. And the important thing to understand is it's necessary to regularize the employment of foreign workers, number one, just to regularize it. The fact that they should have proper terms and conditions, they should have proper salaries, and in this case that they should have proper insurance and proper pensions. You regularize it. If you regularize it, you remove many of the problems that you have with the employment of foreign workers. And then many employers will say, well, it's just as expensive to employ a foreign worker as it is to employ a Malaysian worker, so I might as well offer the Malaysian worker, because at least I'm going to save on the work permit, for example. And at least the Malaysian worker, I can give them a 2, 3, 4, 5-year contract. But for the foreign worker, I can only give them a 1-year contract because I have to renew every year. So that will help the employers, actually. And it will help the employers make a much more clear employment offer to people, right? It's better for Malaysians as a whole. The estimate is that this will put 7 billion ringgit
Savings.
into EPF, right?
Yeah.
I'm an EPF account holder, you all EPF account holders. That means the fund is now 7 billion more. And because the fund is 7 billion more, they have 7 billion to invest.
Yep.
And the Prime Minister has said, well, through the Gear Up program, I want you to invest 120 billion across all the GLICs. They have the money to invest. They have a bigger fund. That means the return on the investment will be better. This money will be invested into the Malaysian economy, right?
Yeah.
Everyone will be better off as a consequence of this, even the employers. The employers, if they find this expensive to employ foreign workers, as has been, this is a nudge issue that you were mentioning, right? If they find it more expensive to employ foreign workers,
They will hire.
tech up, Stop employing the cheap foreign workers and invest in higher technology. Improve your productivity. Make life better for your business by changing your business model instead of relying on cheap foreign labor.
Yeah, it seems like the outlook here, or at least the argument, are very short term, or at least reactive in this sense, right?
But that's always the way. And, of course, it's important, of course, that you have input from the Employers Federation and the Federation of Malaysian Manufacturers. It's important. But they also have to be rational when they make that input. And they can't, every single time that there is a change in employment regulation, whether it's for foreign workers or whether it's for Malaysians, every single time they are negative about it. every single time.
And to add to what you just said, I would even argue that between the income, the basic income policy, and this is a much more, it makes more economic sense to do this rather than having that sort of minimum wage policy,
the flat
floor pricing, mandated on employers.
Yeah.
So
Tricia, you wanted to add something?
just adding, two other reasons why this policy should actually be supported, despite the great resistance from, I'm sure, many of our friends out there in the industry as well. I think we sort of hinted at that, but the whole drive towards digitalization, that's something that the government and the world over would like to mandate, right? And how do we, not just on the digitalization front, but the second one is, how do we have increased complexity, economic complexity in our industries? So to achieve more firms jumping on the digital bandwagon, meaning that they get rid of these old processes, they invest into more high-tech, incorporating tech into the way they do business. And the second thing, which is to increase economic complexity in the way products are manufactured, right? So instead of, we're big on data centers and semiconductors now, right? So instead of being on the low end of processing these microchips, but how do we increase the complexity of what we can process? All of this actually has to do with incentivizing companies to increase the wages and income of the individuals they employ, which also means employing more highly educated individuals, whether they be Malaysians or foreigners. So it's part of a bigger picture, right? So again, policy goals, what direction it is that we want to head towards. The other reason, of course, is when you think about labor standards, look, Malaysia has signed up to these international multilateral agreements. One of the big ones, of course, is the CPTPP. And the CPTPP is an agreement that has a chapter entirely dedicated to labor. And so in terms of adhering to more international labor standards and higher standards, not just for CPTPP, but also for ILO, the International Labour Organization, all these would set an expectation and tone that, look, Malaysian business and the industry will be adhering to higher standards of how we treat our labor. Yeah. So these are all reasons that allow us to, I suppose, play in an international field better. In a way, you can't really reverse this clock.
Right, yeah, understand.
I think that impact on reputation is very important.
Right.
Because we know that in recent past, there have been very many issues on foreign worker treatment, the treatment of foreign workers, which has led not just governments to ban, we had the Indonesia ban, for example, not just at a government level, but also Malaysian companies, particularly supply chain companies, SMEs, which have lost their supply chain contracts. And we had the Tier 3 status from the US for a number of years, right? And this is a very important way of remediating all of that and really raising it's a step change, raising the bar and saying, look, we understand these concerns and we're doing something important, which is making I've never seen a change like this, actually, in 20 years.
The bold
for foreign workers.
Right. Yeah.
In terms of the proper treatment of foreign workers. And that's a very good signal.
That I have heard one argument, which I actually don't think holds water as well, which is the argument that these lower level migrant workers are not planning to retire in Malaysia, so why provide them an EPF account and so on and so forth. But that can easily be torn apart by saying that these are the savings that are rightly theirs, and upon the point of time where they do return home, yes, they may not get repatriated during the X number of years that they do live here, but at the point of returning home, that's theirs to take. Right.
It is a matter of their right.
Right.
I was just saying, it shouldn't be a consideration to begin with.
It's a matter of their right, but also, I'd just like to point out again, it's not just the question of the lower paid workers. The so-called expats like myself, I am a foreign worker, whether you describe it in Latin or whether you describe it in English, right? I am a foreign worker. And if you required my employers to have paid EPF for the 20 years, including at the University of Nottingham, which they didn't, right? So if they had been required to pay that over the course of 20 years, and they did that with the other expatriates, we would stay here longer, we would invest longer, we would buy property because we would have a stake here.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's not just the lower income foreign workers that are affected positively by this. It's the higher income foreign workers who are affected positively.
And a lot more at stake as well.
Yes,
Yeah,
and it's particularly important. Here's why. Because I cannot transfer my UK pension into my EPF because they have a different structure. It's a provident fund, the EPF. It's not a pension fund. And secondly, as a foreigner, I cannot make voluntary contributions into my EPF for reasons I have no idea about. Right?
So even now,
Yes.
you can't make voluntary
No, I could
contributions.
not make voluntary contributions into my EPF.
I mean, it's interesting
Which
that you're
I
giving us
would
this
have
picture.
done,
Yeah.
of course. Once I get the EPF account, I would have done. Why? Because it pays nearly 6%.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's one
Why
of the
wouldn't you?
Yes, why
Exactly.
wouldn't I switch all of my FDs and put it into EPF, right?
Yeah,
Why wouldn't I do that?
I just want to
So
add.
that's an important thing of attracting higher income
Right.
investments into EPF, not just lower income investments.
Yeah, I
We
just
go
want to
to
add
Tricia,
something, which is that we also, as in Malaysians, need to start not discriminating against talent based on their nationality and citizenship. I have employed, brilliant foreigners, whether they're from Indonesia, whether they're from, across developed and developing worlds. And each one of them has brought great talent and productive talent that has contributed, right, to Malaysia. So I absolutely believe that these are the people that we need to invest in, and we're investing into their future, and they in turn invest into our economy
growth,
as well.
Our GDP. Yep.
So think of the talent equally, right, on what they can contribute, on what the productive value is that lies in an individual individual.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah. At least on the EPF's front, its head of policy and strategy department, Balkis Yusof, did say that this is it is done in the best way possible because the country is aligning with the international best practices, and at least it addresses what Dr. Geoffrey did say. The policy would also play a role in addressing the wage distortion issue in the labor market, because the medium wage aspect, right, stands at 29 per ringgit, at least for certain workers, more than the current minimum wage of 1,500 ringgit. Right?
I think Balkis also made the point, because she is fantastic, actually, and the strategy department at EPF is very, very good. But she also made the point, of the technology point, the fact that it will nudge companies to try to think about better ways.
Yeah. I mean, we are going
better
to
ways of doing business.
Correct.
And that's important.
We're becoming a high-income nation.
Yes.
Why not thinking ahead, right? I mean, not even ahead, think like an advanced economy in that sense. Unfortunately, this is the end of the episode. We have two great guests today.
We could have gone on forever.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I do agree. Yeah, to our audience back at home, if you like this particular topic or any other topics, please do comment, like, and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell if you haven't already. Follow us on social media. We are on X, Instagram, Facebook, as well as TikTok. Once again, I'd like to thank my guests that's here on set. First up, Dr. Geoffrey Williams. Thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you as well, Dr. Tricia Yeoh.
Thank you for having me.
And to my co-host, Hazwin Hassan.
Thank you.
My name is Amalina Kamal, and I'll see you next week.